Good evening and welcome. We're so happy that you're with us this evening. I'm Marilee McFarland, the Senior Director of Principia Alumni and Field Relations. The music you heard as you joined is from the Principia College Chamber Orchestra and their performance in the Alumni Virtual Concert in December. While the Holocaust may feel like ancient history, many of its lessons resonate today. In great adversity, we learn the true meaning of grace and courage. And tonight, we're so grateful that you've joined us for this virtual talk with Dr. Gretchen Starr-LeBeau, as she shares with us some of the examples of morally courageous individuals from World War II and the Holocaust, and draws lessons for us today about how to live a life of moral courage wherever we are. We have a few upcoming events this month that we hope that you will join us for. On Thursday, March 25th, we will have part 1 of the Ode to Joy, a celebration of Beethoven concert and lecture series with Dr. Marie Juriet-Beamish. We also hope that you will join us in reading our March book club pick, the New York Times bestseller, His Truth is Marching On, John Lewis and the Power of Hope by John Meacham. The book talk will be led by former Principia history professor, Dr. John Glenn. You can find out more about these events at principia.edu/events. We'll put that link in the chat box. During the talk today, you're welcome to submit any questions in the Q&A box, which we will ask following Gretchen's remarks. The talk today is being recorded and will be posted tomorrow on our virtual events webpage. There you can also find recordings of the concerts and talks over the last 10 months. We will post that link in the chat box. We will also send out the link to the recording tomorrow, as well as some of the books and things that Gretchen references throughout her talk, so that you can read and follow up more on those details. As you may see, closed captioning or live transcription is now available during this evening's talk. You can find the option to turn that on at the bottom of your screen. Before I turn the screen over, I'd like to introduce you to our speaker today. Dr. Gretchen Starr-LeBeau is the Jean and George Todd Professor of Religious Studies at Principia College. She earned her bachelor's at the University of Virginia and her PhD in history at the University of Michigan. Prior to joining the Principia College faculty in 2015, she taught in the history department at the University of Kentucky. Her teaching focuses on comparative religion and the history of religion. Dr. Starr-LeBeau's research addresses Christian and Jewish relations. She also has published work on Jewish converts tried in the inquisitorial courts in Spain, Portugal, and Italy, and on the penance in the early modern world, and she is also a member of the Principia Lifelong Learning faculty teaching courses at summer session. Thank you so much, Gretchen, for preparing this talk for us today, and I will pass it over to you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. I have enjoyed speaking with Prin clubs in previous years when that was an option for us. I look forward to doing it again when that becomes a possibility. And in the meantime, I'm really honored to be able to speak with all of you today. And I'm looking forward to your questions when we get to the end of this talk. It's a little bit different, unlike the Prin Club talks. I don't get to see who's in the audience. And so I feel like I should just point out that the talk's intended to be encouraging, and I'm not going to discuss specific or graphic accounts of events during the Holocaust. But even when discussed in general terms, the Holocaust can be dark, heavy material. And so parents of young children in particular might want to keep that in mind as we're moving forward. This talk emerges from a course that I teach at Principia College. For me, this course, God and the Holocaust, is really a moral imperative. I think it's important that students have the opportunity to learn about the Holocaust, to learn about genocides. And so when I came to Principia College, I was grateful for the opportunity to be able to prepare this class for our students. It's a chance for students both to learn the history of the Holocaust in World War II, and then also to think about Jewish and Christian theological responses to it. At the same time, it's giving students an opportunity to develop their own ethical, spiritual, moral response to the appearance of evil in the world, a response then that they can put into practice in their own lives. And one of the things that I've learned in teaching this course is that learning about others' moral courage in the face of immensely difficult circumstances can be really uplifting and inspiring, but it also is a call to action in our own lives. And so I'll be working that theme into this talk today. Of course, no one can know or tell all the acts of moral courage that occurred during the Holocaust in World War II, or for that matter, during other instances of atrocities and genocidal acts. There certainly wouldn't be time during this talk. And in any case, some of those acts were only known to the participants who were involved. Yet those many acts, great and small, shouldn't blind us to the fact that many people were bystanders. They weren't necessarily aiding the genocide, but they weren't resisting it either. And we also need to acknowledge that some actors were evil, and there were people who behaved immorally, viciously, or even without any apparent ability to distinguish good from evil at all. For my students and for me, one of the challenges of participating in God and the Holocaust, in participating in this course, is to look at those experiences together in juxtaposition, acts of moral courage, and we could call them moral idiocy, moral blindness, and to ask ourselves what led some people to morally courageous acts and led others to the opposite. And in thinking about those hard questions, we strengthen our own moral compass. Now, before we get started, it's important to make sure that we're all on the same page with our terminology. So I just wanted to make sure that we had a working definition of what moral courage is. This is both how I use it and how it gets used generally. Moral courage isn't the same thing as physical courage or just taking action, although it can certainly include that. It's also, moral courage is not an impulsive act, just kind of racing in and doing something. Moral courage is understood to involve a consideration of what is the right thing to do, thinking that through, and then acting accordingly, regardless of what the circumstances, what the consequences of that act might be. I'll point out, by the way, that the picture we're looking at here is the cover of a book that describes one morally courageous town, Le Chambon in France. Lest innocent blood be shed, a couple there encouraged the entire village to bring in shelter and save hundreds of Jews. I'll also let you know as we're moving forward here that the talk has 3 parts to it. First, we're going to look at some impressive acts of moral courage on the part of what we could call allies. That is to say, people who were not directly targeted by the Holocaust, but acted on behalf of people who were. Secondly, we'll examine some expressions of moral courage among those who directly faced oppression. And then finally, we'll finish with a look specifically at a few of the morally courageous acts of Christian scientists during the Holocaust. And when I'm done with my presentation, I'm eager to hear what your questions are. And so with that, we'll get right to it. I think one of the most extraordinary examples of collective moral courage, probably the most extraordinary example of collective moral courage in World War II, was the experience of Denmark. Denmark, obviously just right north of Germany, much smaller than Germany. It had no real ability to defend itself. It was completely overrun by the Nazis when they invaded within 24 hours. But then the Nazi government, while it had a government in Denmark, it was relatively lightly administered. during the beginning period of the war. And immediately after the Nazis invaded, an active Danish resistance movement got started and created quite a lot of problems for the Nazis. By 1943, the Nazi government in Germany, in the headquarters in Berlin, had decided that Denmark needed to be brought into line. And they decided that they were going to enact the final solution in Denmark over Yom Kippur. That's the most significant Jewish holiday of the year. Jews would be at home. And the Nazis decided that they would round up the Danish Jewish population at that point and deport them to concentration camps. And this is where Denmark and Danish history differs from virtually any other place in Europe. Because one of the high Nazi officials in Denmark actually alerted the Danish Jewish community to what was going to happen. This official seems to have liked Denmark quite a bit. He loved Danish people, he loved living in Denmark, and he also knew that if the Nazis attempted to enact the final solution in Denmark, the population would just completely rise up in revolt and the nation would become ungovernable for the Nazis. And so our first morally courageous, if also self-interested act was this Nazi official alerting Danish Jews, the resistance movement, of what was about to happen. Niels Bohr, the eminent Danish physicist, personally made a clandestine visit to Sweden and intervened, asking Sweden to accept Danish Jewish refugees. This was a dangerous thing for Sweden to do. This was a morally courageous act on the part of the Swedish government and the Swedish king. Sweden was officially neutral during World War II, and it was entirely possible that if they accepted refugees, that the Nazis would see that as breaking their neutrality and would invade Sweden. But Sweden made the decision to accept refugees, and they publicly announced that. Within the span of just a few weeks, the Danish resistance movement managed to move virtually all of Denmark's Jews out of Copenhagen, out of the main cities, to the coasts. About, as you can see on the PowerPoint, about 7,200 Jews, and then family members, non-Jewish family members, close to 700 of those. Hundreds of Danes in small boats, like the one that you see here, spent days and days with very little sleep, ferrying the 20 miles back and forth between Denmark and Sweden to successfully, almost completely, relocate all of Denmark's Jews into Sweden, where they were accepted. There were only about 500 Danish Jews who did not manage to make it out on the boats for a variety of reasons. Some of them chose not to leave, some of them for other reasons. Those remaining 500 Danish Jews were, in fact, transported to Terezin, to Theresienstadt, one of the concentration camps. But then the Danish government followed up and harassed the Nazis endlessly. They insisted on being able to have Red Cross visitors to observe conditions in Terezin. They insisted on being able to provide supplies, food, blankets, things like that for the prisoners there. And of those 500 Danish Jews who were transported, all but 51 of them survived and returned to Denmark after the war. This kind of collective action on the part of a population is an extraordinary example of moral courage. A second example I'd like to share for you in another part of Europe is the man we're looking at here, Jan Karsky. This is a photo taken of him in 1944. Jan Karsky was a Polish elite. He was a second lieutenant in the Polish army. He escaped an early massacre by the Soviets of many Polish officers in the army, and was one of the first people to join the Polish resistance. He did quite a lot of work for the Polish resistance. He was captured, tortured, managed to escape. Eventually, he worked as a courier for the Polish government in exile, which was based in London. The Polish government in exile was interested in finding out the state of the resistance in Poland. There were a number of small groups, resistance groups, that didn't always work terribly well together, and they knew there was a massive loss of life in Poland. In the end, 1.8 million Poles would die during World War II, Polish civilians. While Jan Karsky was on this secret mission in occupied Poland, he met with two Jewish resistance leaders, one from the Zionist fighting organization, the ZOB, its acronym in Polish, and one with the Bund. And they insisted that Jan Karsky needed to understand that the situation facing Jews in Poland was even worse than the situation facing other Poles, that there was a larger campaign going on against the Jewish community there. It was difficult for him to comprehend this in the context of already so much loss of life. And so these two Jewish resistance leaders smuggled Jan Karsky into the Warsaw Ghetto so that he could see what was going on there. At that point, the Warsaw Ghetto had about 500,000 people, about 500,000 people crammed into a very small space in Warsaw that was surrounded by walls that are like 15 or 20 feet high when you look at pictures of them. He was aghast at what he saw there. And it was only when he saw what was going on in the Warsaw Ghetto that he realized the extent of the Nazis' final solution to exterminate the world Jewish population. He actually returned, was smuggled in a second time so that he could see more of what was happening in the ghetto. He was smuggled by resistance workers in a borrowed soldier's uniform into a transit camp that was transporting prisoners to a death camp. And as a result of seeing all of that, he then made his way secretly back to the West, to the Allies. He spoke with the Polish government in exile. He spoke with the British government. He spoke actually with FDR. He traveled to the US and spoke to FDR. And to all of these people, he tried to explain to anyone who would listen that there was a genocide going on, that there was something larger going on. It was distressing to him to the end of his life that he was not able to persuade people to move more quickly to protect the Jewish community of Europe. He wrote about what he saw in a book called Story of a Secret State that became a bestseller. And then he remained quiet about what he had done until he was interviewed for a documentary in 1981. His work, however, was not completely towards no purpose. He did increase knowledge of what was going on. And because of that, because of the increased awareness of how vulnerable refugees were within Europe, it helped to create the formation of the War Refugee Board, and then later the Office of High Commissioner for Refugees after the war. So our first takeaway then from the first part of this talk is that individual acts can have a huge impact and great meaning for decades afterward, not only for the individuals who were helped, but for their extended family, their children and grandchildren as well. And furthermore, they have what I call a multiplier effect. They inspire other collective acts as well. The image we're looking at here is the Garden of the Righteous Among the Nations at Yad Vashem, which recognizes these morally courageous actors. Jan Karsky is memorialized here along with many, many others. Of course, we all, I'm sure, hope not to experience the horror of living through the Holocaust or something like it, but we each have the opportunity to act with moral courage in our own lives and showing compassion to the outcast or the marginalized person that you come across in your day, to embrace maybe that work colleague or person in your life who seems difficult or unpleasant or even just lonely. In the second part of the talk, I'd like us to turn now and think about the morally courageous acts of people who were themselves the victims of violence and oppression. This obviously is a much more difficult situation, and options for those who were the direct victims of Nazi violence was necessarily limited. But there are some examples that are quite powerful. And I'd like to start with this 3-year-old boy, Tommy Bergenthal. He and his family are an example of the ways that people demonstrated moral courage. Uh, he and his parents, by the time he was not too long after this photo was taken, were refugees. They were stateless people. They eventually ended up in a ghetto and then were transported to Auschwitz. Each of them, in different ways, needed to act with great courage to protect themselves and one another. They found ways to keep his mother from being coerced by the Nazis into being an informant in the ghetto for the Nazis. His father was in charge of assigning housing within the ghetto where they were located, and he brought integrity to that position and honesty so that people were treated equitably within the ghetto. Later on, he worked as well in the ghetto, in charge of a forced labor community that was providing supplies for the war. When the ghetto was liquidated, that meant that many of the people in the ghetto were executed and a much smaller remaining number were sent to a different ghetto and then later to a concentration camp. His father courageously collected as many of the employees that worked with him as possible and his family, marched up to the Nazi officials and said, "We are all needed. We are essential workers. We are preparing things for the Nazi state." And they were allowed to survive. Even Thomas, as a young boy in the ghetto and later in Auschwitz, he would have jobs as an errand boy. He needed to prove his usefulness. And as an errand boy, he would sit outside the Nazi official's office waiting to be called upon, and he could hear through the door radio broadcasts. And so because his German was quite good, his mother was German, he was able to listen. He made an effort to remember everything that he heard so that he could provide news of the outside world to his family and others. His account of his experience, both during and after the war, shows up in a book that he calls A Lucky Child. And he sees his ability to survive Auschwitz as a matter of luck. But much of that luck is, in fact, the result of others making morally courageous actions, both his family and others. There are other kinds of acts that we can see, morally courageous acts among those in the concentration camps and the forced labor camps, and even very small gestures in that kind of environment are not small. Some inmates at concentration camps wrote songs, shared food with one another, and even had the courage to show compassion, which could itself be an incredibly dangerous thing to do. The image that we're looking at here is a song that was composed in a concentration camp, a prison camp. This was pretty early in the war in 1933, and it's called "We Are the Peat Bog Soldiers." The prisoners were required to work in the peat bogs, digging peat. It was relatively early in the war. There were a high number of political prisoners at this camp, that is to say, socialist, communist enemies of the state, people who had resisted the state, journalists, lawyers, people like that. This song became both a work song and a rallying cry, an anthem. The first time they sang it, by the time they got to the end of the song, Even the Nazi soldiers were singing along with them. And I'd like to point out that this song was the focus of one of my students' research projects last semester. The students all engage in a final research project. They do the research and then they can decide what they want that final project to look like, a paper or something else. I didn't ask them permission if I could give their names, so I'll just use first names. Hannah and Jordan wanted to research music in the Holocaust. They found this song and recorded a performance of it that was really extraordinary. Viktor Frankl, another concentration camp survivor who wrote one of the very first accounts of life in the concentration camp. It's called Man's Search for Meaning. And he too talks about the importance of finding a positive purpose, of encouraging hope, of a sense of inner freedom and love as a kind of morally courageous act that allows people to continue to live. And indeed, that would be my second takeaway for us tonight. How we live each moment, especially in the face of oppression, can be really transformative. Saying yes to life and no to evil makes a difference. We obviously can't judge how others respond in that moment, and we can have enormous compassion for the impossible choices that Nazis forced on those in the camps. We can see that, for example, in some of the most famous memoirs, Elie Wiesel's Night, Primo Levi's book, Survival in Auschwitz. But when we ourselves face moments of darkness, we can work to make the choice to live, to move forward with courageous hope, despite the circumstances that we find ourselves in. Indeed, some Jewish theologians have found this concept so important that they've talked about it in this way. Traditionally, Jews have understood the Hebrew Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament, to have 313 commandments or mitzvot. And after World War II, some Jewish theologians have talked about this moral imperative to choose life in the face of difficult circumstances, and in the wake of the Holocaust in particular, to be the 614th commandment. What we're looking at here is the Hall of Names from Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Jerusalem, a memory of some of those who perished in the Holocaust. Finally, in this last part of the talk, I would like us to think specifically about Christian Scientists and moral courage in World War II. Christian Science was introduced into Germany in the late 18th, early 19th century. Some of you may be familiar with a book published by the Long-Year Society, Frances Thurber Seal's Christian Science in Germany. That's an American woman who came from New York to Germany, not knowing a word of German, to help establish Christian Science because she felt called to do it. At the same time, a German woman, Frau Günther Petersen, also brought Christian Science. She had heard about it when she was traveling outside the country and helped to establish Christian Science where she was located as well. So by the time of World War II, Christian Science had a relatively long history in Germany, but it was not seen with favor by the Nazis. Christian Science by the Nazis was seen to be pro-Jewish. It was associated with the Freemasons, which the Nazis also did not like. It was seen as maybe a cult or magical, and it was also seen as unhygienic because Christian Scientists were not generally going to doctors. Meanwhile, Christian Science churches faced harassment and also were struggling with how to respond to Nazism and the rise of Nazism. Branch churches, for example, debated about what to do with members and visitors who wore Nazi pins into church services. Should they be asked to leave? Should they be allowed to stay? What position should individual churches have vis-a-vis Nazis and supporters of the Nazi state? Eventually, Reinhard Heydrich signed an order banning Christian Science on June 6th. In 1941, he cited its magical occult practices as a reason for that. If you are familiar with the history of World War II, you know that Reinhard Heydrich was responsible. He was the prime architect of the final solution, that is to say, the plan to exterminate all Jews in Europe. And if you're familiar with World War II, you'll also know that the final solution is ramping up at about the same time. Right? There are a number of accounts of how Christian Scientists responded with moral courage during these last years of the war. There are a ton of sources that are available, a ton of incredibly inspiring and moving accounts in Christian Science publications, in publications of the Long Year Society. I can't review them all here, but they're really worth the time to read. And I particularly want to call attention to a lengthy account in a book called A Century of Christian Science Healing. It's an account by a woman named Adrienne Vinciguerra, and it's not available anyplace else. And I have to say, the more that I research and teach the Holocaust, the more extraordinary her account becomes. She's in a prisoner of war camp because her parents are members of the resistance. And one day she's praying, has a realization of her spiritual nature as a child of God, and walks out of the camp in broad daylight. Instead, however, spending more time talking about her, I want to draw attention to an account that I suspect is probably much less familiar to most people in the audience. It's also, I think, particularly interesting because it shows us how at least one Christian Scientist in the camps appeared to others around him. This is a person who is called Jérémie Regard in a book by Jacques Lucéron called The World is Beginning Today, or in English, I think the translation of the title, the English title is And There Was Light. At one point, sort of in passing, Lucéron describes Jérémie. We know it's probably a pseudonym because regard just means to look or to see. He describes this man as a Christian Scientist, as a welder, as a simple man from the Jura Mountains, kind of on the Swiss-French border. And here, in part, is how Lucéron describes him. Jérémie did not speak of the concentration camps either, even when he was there. He did not have his gaze nailed to the smoke from the crematorium, nor on the 1,200 terrified prisoners of Block 57. He was looking through. Each time he appeared, the air became breathable. I got a breath of life smack in the face. This was perhaps not a miracle, but it was at least a very great act, and one of which he alone was capable. Jérémie's walk across the quad was that, a breathing. In my memory, I can follow distinctly the path of light and clarity which he made through the crowd. I didn't understand then who he was, but I certainly saw him. And this image began to work inside me until the moment it lit up like a torch. We're looking here, by the way, at an image of Buchenwald, which is where Lucéron and Jérémie were held. Finally, I'd like to draw attention to the experiences of another Christian Scientist during the war, a German child and teen named Arno Preller. This experience might be familiar to longtime listeners of what at least at one point was called the Christian Science Sentinel Radio Edition. And I won't repeat the whole account in detail because that would deprive you of the opportunity to listen to it in its entirety, and it absolutely deserves that attention. As I say, Arno Preller was a child at the beginning of the war and a teen. Later, by the end of the war, he was a teenager. His father was the Assistant Committee on Publication for Germany. because this meant that he was affiliated with the American church. And then certainly once Christian Science was banned, he was arrested. Arno Preller's father was arrested and then forced to serve in the army. At that point, Arno Preller refused to participate any longer in Hitler Youth, and that was illegal. So Arno Preller also was arrested and was sent to a forced labor camp. He had an experience there, which he describes in the 2005 Sentinel Radio Edition article I list here. It's an excellent example of what moral courage can mean for a Christian Scientist. Because he spoke German, he was delegated by some of the people that he knew in the camp to request a Christmas celebration from the camp commandant. A Christmas celebration in the context of a forced labor camp means singing a few Christmas carols after dinner one night. He did that, and the commandant threw him and all the other organizers into solitary confinement, which was a death sentence. Within solitary confinement, Arno Preller says that he prayed, he gained a sense of the presence that he wasn't alone, that the presence of the Christ in this Christmas period was with him. And within a few days, he was released from solitary confinement, not to go to the gallows, but in fact, to be allowed to hold their Christmas celebration after all. I hope you'll listen to the whole piece, which is much more interesting than the short version I'm giving you. And this brings us to our third takeaway tonight, and that is the powerful moral courage of prayer and forgiveness. In later years, Arno Preller came to see the value of forgiveness, and he described that in another article that he wrote for the Christian Science Sentinel called Why Forgive? Thomas Bergenthal, from a completely secular point of view, also identifies forgiveness as central to how he and his mother were able to move forward after the war when they lived in Germany. He describes himself, he was only 11 when the war was over. He describes himself as going from a child who wished that he could mount a machine gun on the balcony of his house and mow down the people responsible for the death of his family members, to recognizing that vengeance wouldn't bring anyone back, and then moving past that even to recognize that protecting humanity from atrocities meant breaking the cycle of violence and hatred entirely. And in fact, those convictions formed in childhood motivated his life's work in human rights, and he went on to serve as a judge at the International Court of Justice in The Hague. Both Bergenthal and Preller agree that people must face consequences for wrongdoing, but each day, they argued, we, all of us, to a greater or lesser extent, in big or small ways, have the opportunity to take that morally courageous action of forgiving and of prayer. As we're moving to the end of our talk, I just want to leave you with one last thought. Students who take God and the Holocaust know that whenever we discuss yet another difficult reading assignment, and it happens a lot in God and the Holocaust, whenever we have those discussions, we don't stop there. We have those discussions and then we talk about how will we move forward? What will we do in our own lives today, this week, to respond to the appearance of evil around us? You don't need to be in the midst of darkness to take a stand for what's right. Opportunities for moral courage aren't necessarily flashy. They may be as simple as showing kindness to someone who's suffering, or saying no, even in a small way, to acts of injustice, envy, cruelty, or dishonesty. And I can think of no better conclusion to this talk than to repeat the words attributed to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. If I cannot do great things, I can do small things in a great way. Thank you so much, and I am happy to open up the floor for questions.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Gretchen, for such a great talk. And I invite you all to enter your questions into the Q&A box, which should appear at the bottom or top of your screen. The first question that we have for you is, why did the Nazis care about Denmark's insistence on giving food and supplies, etc.?
That's a great question. We don't tend to think about it this way, but the Nazis do have a certain degree of interest in how things look to the outside. They know enough that what they're doing is wrong, that they don't want people to be entirely aware of it. And so when people are insistent on being able to participate in small ways, not to undo the concentration camp system, but to provide blankets and food for a small number of people, they allow that to happen. In fact, Thomas Bergenthal is visited by the Norwegian Red Cross, and that's part of the reason he survives.
That's great. You shared about the example of your students and their presentations. Do you have other examples of presentations that students gave in that class, God and the Holocaust?
You bet. I have to say, teaching God in the Holocaust is a demanding class, but it is my favorite class to teach, and the students who take it are tremendous. And so we have, as I said, a final research project, but because the class is intense and demanding material, I want students to be able to make the product of that research be something that's meaningful to them. So some students write research papers. I had one student a couple of years ago who wrote about uh, the Monitor's reporting of World War II and the Holocaust, and did an analysis of how the Monitor covered that, which was a fantastic presentation, a fantastic paper. I had another student who wrote an excellent paper looking at performances of The Merchant of Venice that were staged during World War II, both within the Nazi state in Austria and outside the Nazi state in Tel Aviv, in what's now Israel. At that point, British Mandate Palestine. I've had students put together other kinds of projects in addition to this musical piece. I had one student create an original composition of music that was absolutely breathtaking and heartbreaking. I've had students create fantastic works of art focused on some particular aspect of research that they engaged in about the Holocaust. So it's a really great group of students, and it's really fantastic work that they produce.
That's great. Let's see, can you say anything about what you've discovered about how people forgive in situations which they are still vulnerable to that maltreatment? The examples that you've shared are that forgiveness happens to people later. So when they're still in that situation.
That's a really hard question. And that's a hard place to be, because forgiveness isn't being a doormat. Forgiveness is having the courage not to want to retaliate, but not denying the need of people to answer for wrongdoing. I think that is very difficult to do in a moment of oppression. Not impossible, but difficult.
Yeah. We've had a few questions asking for the references. So we will be sending the references tomorrow. Gretchen has put together a wonderful document. So tomorrow when we email out the link to the recording from the talk, we will also include a link to the references from today. So let's see, what Just sorry, just going through the questions. Um, how were the Danes able to get all of the Jews out without being stopped by the Nazis?
Uh, okay, Denmark includes, it's very small, it includes hundreds of islands. Uh, Fishing is kind of central to the Danish economy, and even more so in the 30s and 40s. So there were a lot of very small boats that people were using, and they went primarily at night. And 20 miles is not, um, it's not super, super far. And from accounts I've read, like people's hands, they were like using rowboats. The boat in the picture looks a little bit uh, grander than that. Not big, but a little bit grander. But there were individual rowboats that were going. They were very small. They were leaving from a variety of places along the coast, away from the big city. They were going to a variety of places. They went primarily at night, and they went fast. Like people's hands were, uh, they were having to wrap their hands to keep them from bleeding as they, because they were doing so much rowing.
Are there any books that you would recommend either for children or teens or adults to help them understand what went on during this time? I think they're saying fiction or nonfiction. Just to help to tell that story.
Uh, there are a ton of good books out there, both fiction and nonfiction. Uh, it is, I think, selecting a book for your child is something that is that you are really going to have to gauge your child's sensitivity and awareness. Um, Two titles that come to mind are Anne Frank, which I think a lot of people were reading in the 70s and 80s, and is still I think a very useful introduction to what was happening in World War II without dealing with the really difficult part of that experience for her after they were taken to Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Um, a more recent book and a fiction account is The Book Thief, uh, and that's for kids who are older kids who are prepared for that. I think is a good example. There are so many works for adults. I can't even begin to think. Marilee and I were talking about, what is it called, the Book of Lost Names,
Yeah.
just today, and so many people have already read All the Light We Cannot See, but sometimes historical fiction is hard for me because I'm always like, in my head, there's always that checklist of, is it authentic? Is it not authentic? Like, I can't always turn the historian off. Uh, but All the Light We Cannot See was a completely compelling and really extraordinary book, and inspired in part by Lucéron, the man who wrote about Jérémie.
That's great. Thank you. So turning back to your course, which I'll just add in here that I reached out to Gretchen about this talk based on a request that came from an alum after reading the article in The Purpose about about her class, God and the Holocaust. So can you give a little bit of background about how this course was developed and created and how long it's been taught and then how often it's taught? And this individual mentions that the course seems like just such a great representation of the unique place Principia has in the field of education. So would love to just know a little bit more about that
You
course and
bet.
the history of it.
Oh, I love this class, and I love talking about this class. Uh, so when I was at the University of Kentucky, I was part of the Jewish Studies faculty, and I taught the second half of Jewish Civilization, which had a Holocaust component to it. But we had a Holocaust course. I would never have taught it at Kentucky. Uh, what allows me to teach that course at Principia, and what I love, I mean, it is a demanding course, but what I love about teaching it at Principia is that, first of all, I can teach it as God and the Holocaust. We think both about the history and about the theology, and students come to that class with a wide kind of range of positions on how they're thinking through their relationship with Christian Science. Uh, but all of them are willing to think through hard questions. They're willing to be engaged, and they're willing to take up this challenge to move forward and develop an ethical response to the appearance of evil. And that would have been very difficult to do. I mean, I loved my time at the University of Kentucky, but that would have been very difficult to do at Kentucky. And it is a unique opportunity to get to teach this course at Prin. I came in 2015, as Marilee said, and I started teaching this course in the fall of 2016, so the beginning of my second year, and I teach it every other autumn.
That's great. So for our last question, I'm going to combine a few that have come in. Where do you see examples of moral courage today? And can you speak to seeing some of those examples and some of the atrocities that we're seeing right now with some of the current genocide events that are taking place?
How we can see examples of this in what's happening now?
Yeah. So, and I think you can separate those
Right.
or combine them. So,
Right. Uh, I think there are a couple of things. One is a couple of ways to approach that question. One is that as we are, as we educate ourselves about what's happening in the world, and the Monitor is a tremendous resource for this because of the way in which Monitor journalism works. We can learn both about dark things that are happening in the world, and we can be looking for those moments of light, those small moments of light that are occurring. That's one part of it. Uh, being informed and choosing how we're informed, maybe not in a like Twitter kind of way, but in a deeper kind of Monitor journalism sort of way. Not that I'm opposed to, not that I'm harshing on social media. I think the other response to that, though, and equally important, is the attitude that we bring to thinking about these world issues, thinking about them in our own thought, taking a stand for light, in our own thought, insisting that darkness isn't the only thing that's happening. And we can, and I'm not saying it's easy, but we can always make that stand.
well, thank you so much. Thank you for your talk today and for just giving us tangible examples of how we can express moral courage in small or big ways in our lives. So thank you, Dr. Gretchen Starr-LeBeau, for being with us this evening. And thank you all. We hope that you will join us for our upcoming events in March, from the Ode to Joy concert with Dr. Marie Jarriett Beamish to reading the March Book Club pick, His Truth is Marching On, John Lewis, and The Power of Hope by John Meacham. So please visit principia.edu/events for more details on all of these upcoming events. And thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you, everyone, for being here.